Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. I am really honored to participate in the opening of this wonderful exhibition, Unbinding Bodies, which explores the practice of foot binding from the perspectives of social, colonial, and medical histories. There's a lot to see because the history of foot binding is complex, complicated, rich, and really long, much longer actually than the history of the corset or whalebone bodies, as it was called in Europe, which came into being in Europe during the first half of the 16th century. So just briefly, I would like to introduce the binding of feet from three perspectives: its history, its practice, how is it done, and the lotus shoes themselves. So the history. In China, the aesthetic ideal of small, dainty feet can be traced as early as to the 9th century, when the story of Ye Xian, or the Chinese Cinderella and her evil stepmother, first appear in print. There is a Chinese Cinderella. Although we do not know at the time, although we do not know if women in the 9th century actually cut off their toes or did anything drastic in order to conform to the ideal. But we do know for a fact that by the 13th century, foot binding had become a rather fashionable practice among daughters from elite families, because archaeologists actually found in 13th century tombs in southern China small shoes and binding cloth. These are not so small, but they are narrow shoes. The style you would see, actually, the similar style from the later time you would see in the exhibition. So we can say that for sure by the 13th century, small feet had become an actual social practice. So how did it end? The last reported case of young girls having their feet bound was as late as 1957, the second half of the 20th century. But the binding in 1957 was unsuccessful because soon afterwards, the girls were walking on the streets outside their homes, and soldiers actually found them and forced them to unwrap their binding cloth on the order of the government at the time. The majority of women with bound feet, we can say, were born before the 1930s. And unfortunately, they are very, very old, and most of them are no longer with us. So in this long 800 to 1,000-year-old history, foot binding actually expanded socially and geographically as it spread from elite to lower class families, and also from the southern part of the empire to virtually all of the regions of China. So it's actually really strange. Why did such a painful, torturous practice last so long? Even more curiously and more directly, why did the women do it? Were they so stupid? I cannot actually fully answer this question. It's rather complicated in this short talk, but I would like to encourage all of you to view the exhibition yourself in Hamburg and in Berlin, to try to find the answers for yourself. For now, I would just suggest that the conventional common answer that women are either so stupid or they are so victimized by patriarchy in order to please the man. They resort to this kind of extreme practice. This answer is not wrong, but I would say way too simplistic. Way too simplistic. For one thing, throughout the history of foot binding, almost all the men who wrote about it were condemning the practice. They hated it. Perhaps like us, they find it cruel, painful, repulsive, and inexplicable. They begged the women to stop torturing themselves. Emperors tried to outlaw the practice from above, always failed. So why did the men's opposition fail? That to me is the real question, and it's not so straightforward to answer. So next, I want to go to my second section, which is called the practice. How was it actually done? Because I think in order to understand the enduring female investment in the binding of their own feet, modifying their own body, we may need to begin by examining, understanding how the binding was done. So in families that could afford to essentially remove one girl, one pair of hands, feet, away from working in the fields to bring in the food or the firewood, for families that could afford to do that, the mother, grandmother, or an aunt would start to prepare the materials needed when a daughter reached 5 or 6 years old, very young. So the materials would include binding cloth, shoes, and medicinal powder, all made by the elder women's own hands. The elder women would then consult the household almanac to choose the most auspicious day to start. Then they would make an offering at the local temple to the goddess, praying that the bones will be soft and the girl's flesh as pliable as possible. So on the appointed day, the women would shush away, send away the men, close the bedroom door, and toughen up their resolve, toughen up their hearts. No pain, no gain. They would remind themselves and the young girl of the women's lot in life. Historically, there are two ways of binding feet. The less extreme, strenuous style was called the straight arch, which was the norm from the 17th to the 16th centuries in the first half of the history of foot binding. The desired goal was a pair of long and narrow feet by folding the 4 digits, the 4 toes under, and then winding the binding cloth tightly around the length of the foot along the narrow, along the metatarsals. The flat lotus shoes you would see in some part of the exhibition were made to accommodate this kind of narrow pair of feet. This was, as you can imagine, a relatively mild form of binding that allowed the gait of the women to be changed. It made her feet longer, but not necessarily too much shorter. I mean, narrower, but not necessarily too much shorter. And it definitely did not cause her to stumble or to hobble and to fall on her heels or something. Unfortunately, the invention of high heel shoes like this in the 15th and 16th centuries, usher in a second and much more extreme and destructive form of binding feet, which is called the bent or a triangular arch. So the mother would have to not only fold down the 4 toes, the 4 digits, but also wrap the binding cloth in order to bend the parts where the metatarsal join the cuneiform bones of the tarsals into a triangular shape. As you can imagine, this would drastically reduce the distance between the big toe, which remain unbound, and the heel area of the foot. So no bones are actually broken, don't worry. But the ligaments between the phalanges, the toes, and the metatarsals were stretched downward towards the heel so much that it caused a lot of pain. The impossibly small high heel shoes that you would see in the exhibition were made for this kind of extreme binding, the triangular arch. Looking at the history, we may say that the practice of foot binding, very similar actually to the point shoes of the ballerina, was born of a utopian desire to overcome the stubborn material body and actually the pull of gravity. This was especially true of the first or the straight arch phase of the practice. In the second or the extreme phase of a bent arch, the impossible ideal of a 3-inch golden lotus feet, what used to be a utopian dream, had turned into an actual dystopian target that numerous women strove for in an effort to outsmart, outdo, outmaneuver their sisters and neighbors in the marriage market. So I want to end by taking a look at the shoes they made and wore themselves. To be exact, the real subject of envy and competition among women is not really the size of the naked foot, which after all was hidden underneath layers of binding cloth, socks, leggings, and could not be easily seen by anybody other than themselves, let alone, being measured with a tape measure. The actual target of competition is the size and the visual effect of the lotus shoe. The exhibition showcases various regional styles of lotus shoes, but since I cannot touch them, I'm using one from my teaching collection to illustrate some of the key questions that we can bear in our head as we, go around. 3 questions. First, how is the size? What is the size and the structure of the shoe? This one, you might be curious to know, measured 12 centimeters from the tip of the toe to the back of the heel, and the heel itself is 3 centimeters long. The heel is actually stiffened hard because the core is made of lathe wood, but the surface was stretched with a beautiful piece of embroidered silk, and so is the bottom of the sole. So we can tell that the stiffness of the wooden heel and the soft padding inside the heel area suggests that the shoes, although impossibly small, were actually made for wearing. And inside, you would see actually marks of sweat and discoloring. The second question, so first is size and structure. Because the answer to the first question leads to the second question, which was, how does the physics of the shoe accommodate the human foot and support the wearer's body weight? How is it supposed to be worn? Are there signs of it actually being worn on the inside or the outside? This is particularly an important and interesting question because as you go around, I would like you to imagine the two forms of binding that I just talked about, the long, narrow one and the triangular one. And imagine which part of the foot is actually accommodated inside the shoe itself. So for these high heel shoes, definitely intended for the triangular form of binding, you would imagine that the pouch, the triangle, which is the bulk of the body weight of the foot, actually, is actually outside the shoe, like this. So in other words, very often we see such a small shoe, but the actual mass of the foot is definitely bigger than the shoe itself, because the actual foot is outside, but you don't see it when you have a skirt, that covers up to here. The third question we ask of a lotus shoe is, what are the decorative motifs and what meaning do they convey? For these shoes, maybe it's difficult to see, but at the back of the heel, you see a beautiful inverted butterfly. At the bottom of the sole, you see a pair of peaches. On one side of the tip of the toe, another butterfly frolicking in flowers, and on the other side, goldfish playing with some algae in water. Sorry that the shoe is a little discolored, so it's quite difficult to see, but nonetheless, the stitching is quite fine. So what do these symbols mean? A lot or nothing? This is very contradictory, actually, because the double peach is the sign of longevity, and it tends to appear on the shoes for old senior women. But all of the other symbols of nature are signs of the kind of vibrant life force of spring. So they are mildly erotic because all these life forces in spring bring to mind actually the regenerative force of the cosmos and in the human world, which actually the sexual intercourse of butterflies or human beings initiate this new cycle. So is it given all of these erotic symbolisms, does it mean that this is a shoe for gaming in the entertainment quarters. I don't know. There are a lot I actually don't know. But my point is simply that as you go around the exhibition, pay close attention to the shoe, the size, the structure. How does it accommodate the weight of the wearer and the symbolisms? Because I think the lotus shoes often made by the women who wore them, they really bear the imprint of the women's bodies, their handicraft skills, not to mention the dreams and aspirations, hopes for a better future, even though it may or may not work out for them. So to conclude, why on earth did women bind their feet? Why did the man's opposition to foot binding all fail? Why did they defy the man and continue to bind their daughters' feet even until the modern colonial age of the 19th and 20th centuries, when the anti-foot binding movement about which the exhibition actually provide a lot of really excellent coverage and information, fascinating. So why? From my brief talk, what do you think are some of the explanations for the women's stubborn adherence to this millennial practice? I would just end by throwing some keywords out so that you can maybe keep some of them in mind as you walk around. Why? Why did women defy the men? Custom, fashion, competition, pride, marriage, women exclusive culture, rituals. These are some of the keywords that I have touched on. Less obvious ones you may also keep in mind: ethnic identity. Foot binding became a sign of the Han majority ethnic identity, but not the ethnic minority groups, or even regional identity. So I'm sorry that I cannot actually see the exhibition. Lucky you. Thank you very much.